Welcome, everybody. This is John Windhausen, Executive Director of the SHLB Coalition. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to another in our series of USF webinars. Today's topic is called Universal Service Reform after the Fifth Circuit Consumers Research Decision. In July of this year, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in a 9-7 vote of the full en banc court that the existing Universal Service Fund contribution system is unconstitutional. This decision sent shockwaves through the broadband industry and with so many of the public interest groups like SHLB. SHLB is particularly concerned, of course, because of our strong advocacy for the E-rate program and the Rural Healthcare Program, which are two of the four programs underneath the Universal Service Fund umbrella. But the impact of the court's decision is quite broad and could also affect the financial support for rural broadband companies and low-income consumers as well, basically all of the beneficiaries of the Universal Service Fund. Fortunately, the Fifth Circuit Court did agree to stay its decision pending review by the Supreme Court, and the federal government, according to the FCC chairwoman, is going to be filing a cert petition to the Supreme Court next week. And so that is a source of uncertainty, how the Supreme Court will take up this case and how they will rule. In the meantime, the universal service fee keeps going up. It was recently announced that the universal service fee will rise to 35.8%, its highest level ever. Congress is also taking a look at reforming the Universal Service Fund and has created a bipartisan, bicameral working group to consider changes to the universal service system. So the future of the Universal Service Fund is murky, to say the least. Fortunately, we have three distinguished experts on the Universal Service Fund with us today, each representing a different point of view, and they're going to help us understand the dynamics and potential outcomes of the court cases, the FCC's actions, and perhaps the congressional debates. So it's a tall order, but we're excited to have this very lively conversation. Before we get started, just a few logistics. We do want to express our thanks once again to our corporate sponsors, Zayo, T-Mobile, Ready, and Cisco. We very much appreciate their financial support for the SHLB Coalition. I will also remind everyone that the webinar is recorded and will be available on our website for 30 days after today. Audience members are muted. We encourage you to use the Q&A box, not the chat box, but the Q&A box to send us your questions. You can still use the chat box to offer your thoughts if you'd like to, but if you would like to address a specific question to the panelists, we encourage you to use the Q&A box. You can follow us along on social media as well, and you can see the hashtag there and at SHLB Coalition if you want to continue that conversation. Just a quick word about SHLB membership. If you're not a SHLB member and you appreciate what we're doing, we would love for you to join SHLB. Membership dues are our primary means of financial support. So we really appreciate our members, and that's what allows us to hold these webinars and to do the work that we're doing. So if you're not a member, please consider joining. Here are 3 reasons why you might want to consider joining us. Now, we have a strong impact on broadband policy and broadband funding. We also facilitate connections and collaborations with government officials and other industry and other public interest groups. And joining SHLB allows you to stay ahead of the curve. And we provide real-time information about what's happening inside the Beltway that could affect your business and your operations. So with that introduction, let me turn to our 3 speakers. We've got an outstanding panel. We're going to start the presentation with Glenn Richards. Glenn is a member in the Washington, D.C. office of Dickinson, Wright, specializing in telecommunications law. He's been active in USF reform efforts for more than 10 years and predominantly represents USF contributors in compliance with the FCC and USAC rules. And Glenn also represents the Voice on the Net Coalition as one of his clients. Second, we will hear from Mike Romano, who is Executive Vice President of NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association. And then third, we will hear from Seth Cooper, who is Director of Policy Studies and a Senior Fellow at the Free State Foundation. Seth is the author of numerous articles and essays on federal telecommunications and technology policy, regulatory reform, and intellectual property. So we've asked each speaker to make opening comments of about 7 to 8 minutes. And then we will engage in a spirited Q&A session for the second half of this webinar. And we really do encourage your questions. I have my questions already prepared, but we'd love to hear from those of you who are joining us online. And please type in your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to answer them either in writing or orally during the course of this webinar. So thank you again to everybody. Let's get started with Glenn Richards. Go ahead, Glenn, take it away.
Great. Thanks, John. And I want to thank you and Shelby for having me. So I'll start off by admitting I'm old. I've been doing this for 39 years. So I've actually been thinking about universal service issues for, since the 96 Act. When I first started, payphones were actually essential services. So a lot has changed. The reference to 10 years ago was back then I was participated in an industry group that was trying to develop a consensus on USF contribution reform. At that time in 2014, the contribution factor was 16.1%. But frankly, we knew back then that was going to be short-lived because we already saw that voice and other communication services were moving to unregulated platforms. We were studying, at that time, we were studying alternatives to revenues, including assessing access lines or telephone numbers. Each of those options had definitional challenges, but frankly, to my thinking, and again, these represent my views, not my clients, numbers and access lines were more stable and less subject to gaming the system than the current revenues. The revenue factors are. However, at that time, consumer groups were concerned that the industry was, using this process in order to shift the burden from business to residential customers. So ultimately, that effort failed. In 2022, I was part of the USF Forward initiative that Michael and John were both part of, along with about 330 other groups that were supporting the assessment of broadband revenues to stabilize the fund. At that time, the contribution factor was 25.2%, and estimates were that by including broadband in the revenue base, the factor would be about 5 to 7%. Those of us participating in the USF Forward initiative thought that was a relatively simple solution within the FCC's jurisdiction, but we knew it was politically sensitive, and ultimately that effort also failed. So here we are today looking at a fourth quarter contribution factor of 35.8%, a new high, along with the uncertainty caused by the Fifth Circuit decision that came out in July. Congress has vowed to address USF reform, but it's an election year. This is complicated, so don't hold your breath. So what is the Fifth Circuit decision? What is it about? The Fifth Circuit, as John mentioned, on a 9-7 vote, found that the mechanism used to fund USF was unconstitutional. And just to go back, this was based on a challenge of the first quarter 2022 contribution factor. This decision ran counter to two prior decisions issued by the Sixth Circuit and the 11th Circuit, finding that the funding mechanism was actually constitutional. And in both of those cases, the petitioners, Consumers Research, sought Supreme Court review of those decisions, and that was refused. This circuit split now that we have between the Fifth and on the other side of this, the Sixth and the 11th, raises the likelihood that the Supreme Court is going to accept this case on cert. In the meantime, the FCC remanded the case, the decision back to the FCC for further proceedings. And while it's been a couple of months since, and the FCC has had the opportunity to actually seek further comment on how to decide whether it can or cannot fix this constitutional problem that's been raised by the court. The FCC to date has not done that. And as John mentioned, I think the FCC is of the mind that it's going to be petitioning for review by the Supreme Court. In the interim, the Fifth Circuit has actually delayed issuing its mandate, which would suggest that the order was effective. Based on the request of the FCC, the concern was that if the Fifth Circuit issued that mandate, that contributors would look at that and potentially decide we are not going to contribute going forward because this funding mechanism is unconstitutional, and even more problematically, potentially asking for refunds. So the court, at the request of the commission, has paused issuance of the mandate. It's fully expected that the FCC is going to seek cert by the end of the month, which is the deadline by which the Fifth Circuit gave it to do that. In brief, and I know Seth's going to talk a little bit more about the legal issues raised in the case, but in brief, the Fifth Circuit found that USF contributions were akin to a tax, which is strictly a legislative function. And while Congress may designate that power to tax to the FCC, in this case, the court decided that it really didn't provide adequate guidance and guidelines to the FCC to follow. And then the FCC, as a result of its decision to subdelegate some of its responsibilities to USAC, a private entity which the court found to be in violation of what's known as the legislative vesting clause. And according to the court, the result is a USAC-fashioned USF tax. The court stated that it has grave concerns about the constitutionality of the USF statute under the Supreme Court's non-delegation precedent. The court rejected the FCC's contention that the USF contributions were a fee and not a tax. The court said the payment was not a voluntary act, but a condition of doing business in the telecom industry, and does not confer any benefits on the payers into the fund. The court also said because the cost is not borne by the parties the FCC regulates, but is overwhelmingly passed on to consumers as permitted by FCC rules, it was reminiscent of a classic tax. And finally, it said the benefits don't inure to the public broadly, but only those that receive the subsidies from USAC, not the entities that are otherwise paying the fees. There were dissenting opinions, which I'm not going to get into. And of course, FCC Chairwoman Rosenworcel issued a statement saying that the decision was misguided and wrong, and stating that the FCC will pursue all available avenues for review. So how does this get resolved? Who knows? The FCC really can't rely on this Supreme Court, which has shown basically disdain for administrative agencies, to save the day. I know that that's the next logical step, but I'm not sure there's any Supreme Court scholar that's going to feel comfortable to suggest that the FCC is going to win at the end of the day. The FCC is free to revisit how it works with USAC. It could put out seek public comment, and it can change the relationship between it and USAC so that it takes on more of those responsibilities without delegating those to USAC. But that doesn't address the ballooning and unsustainable contribution factor, which some people are predicting we're going to be by 40% next year. I think the FCC has the authority today to assess broadband. And as I stated earlier, there is wide acceptance that that would fix this problem, at least the ballooning contribution factor. It doesn't resolve the consumer's research issues about the delegation problem, but as a way to attack the contribution factor, I think it makes sense to revisit whether to assess broadband or not. I know that there are entities that are advocating for expansion of the payer base by assessing tech companies who are large users of communication services. I personally think that's problematic. I don't think the FCC has the authority to do that. B, I don't think Congress is going to get on board on expanding it. And frankly, I think definitionally, the way the statute is written is that these are applied to telecommunications service providers. I think trying to define who those tech companies are, who should pay, who shouldn't pay, I think is basically an enormous conundrum. And of course, Congress can act. Congress has had the ability to act on this for, 20 years, 10 years. John mentioned that there's this bipartisan working reform group. Nothing's going to happen this year. And I think that we're at a point where, given the expected slim majorities of either party in Congress next year, any resolution of this is going to be potentially a miserable compromise for one party or both. So I think we're at a point where, 10 years ago, I was a fan of transitioning away from revenues to numbers. To me, it seemed simple and sustainable. I don't know whether, if that change had been made 10 years ago, whether Consumers Research or some other entity would have challenged the role of USAC in funding and distribution. But it seems to me that a 50-cent or $1 assessment on a phone number sounds far less menacing than a 35% tax on all communication services. So I think I'll leave it there and hand it back to John. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Glenn. That was a perfect rendition of laying the groundwork and describing the status of things. Within you mixing in some of your own personal opinions about where things are going. So that was a really great way to set up the rest of this conversation. So thank you. Next, we'll turn to Mike Romano with NTCA. Mike, you and I have been working on this issue too for a long time, and you've got a lot of companies within NTCA that have a big stake in the future of the Universal Service Fund. So we're very glad to hear from you. Take it away.
Thank you, John. I'm glad to be here, and thanks. Yeah, that's a good introduction to sort of what I want to touch upon, which is the potential implications of this decision for providers and for the consumers and communities they serve, in our case in particular, rural areas. So just a little background on NTCA. We represent about 850 small rural broadband providers in the most rural parts of the country. The densities they serve on average are about 6 to 7 subscribers per square mile. They serve about 30+% of the U.S. landmass, but less than 5% of the U.S. population. Just to give you a little bit of background, they have been leveraged universal service support loans from banks as well as USDA, private capital over the years to do a lot of investing in broadband. And I want to come back to that in a little bit, but just to set the stage a little bit in terms of the statistics of what they have achieved to date, using it, among other things, universal service support to help make the business case for investment. In 2018, 57% of their customers on average had access to 100 megabits or better, and 58% on average had access to fiber to the prem networks. On average today, those numbers are both 84%. So just in the last 6 years alone, we've seen a 26% increase in terms of the number of customers who are getting better broadband. 23% of those customers in 2018 had access to gigabit level services on average. Today, it's 67%. And this is probably the most, I think, important statistic in some ways. In 2018, 15% of customers were subscribing to 100 megabits or better broadband. Today, it is 60% on average. So you've seen, I think, this helps to show and underscore how universal service is an important component, one piece of a puzzle, not the entirety of the puzzle, in helping to make sure, and you can see the track record, in connecting rural communities better and making sure those connections last. In terms of this interplay with universal service and what drove these investments and the use of these networks, I want to be really clear. A lot of folks sometimes confuse universal service with grant programs and the like. Universal service, and sometimes they'll say, for example, well, once the network is built, once the grant's been paid for, once the, otherwise it's been deployed, there's no ongoing need for support. They think of this as a one-time subsidy. And I think that's a mistake. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of rural broadband network economics, because again, a lot of these networks were not paid for with grants. They were paid for with private capital or loans, and there's ongoing expenses, operating expenses, And there's the challenge to keep rates affordable. The fundamental mission of universal service is not to build networks. It's to make sure that consumers have access to reasonably comparable services at reasonably comparable rates. Building a network that's sufficient and reliable and resilient and robust is a prerequisite to that, but that is not in and of itself the end goal. Hence the need at times in certain places, depending on what the sort of economics show, for ongoing support to make sure services are affordable and that the operating expenses that would otherwise need to be passed through to the consumers in those communities can be covered. So, we're also heavily involved. We support the E-rate program. We support the rural healthcare program. We're active participants in the Lifeline program. So I have a lot of interaction with all of these programs over time. In terms of the risks of what the court decision could mean to rural consumers and communities, we took a look recently, did a survey of about 200 members. And what we found is that on average, if universal service support were eliminated, these providers might have to charge as much as $72 more per month on average in order to recover those costs from the consumers of operating those networks and recovering their initial investment if they couldn't find some other way to operate or change up how they do business. You think about $72 a month, that's more than twice what ACP was, and that's spread across an entire rural community. So the implications for entire rural communities could be significant in terms of the rates that consumers pay per month. Another way that providers could try to handle the cash flow loss associated with the loss of universal service support would be to stop investing, to manage their cash flows by basically saying, we're not going to do any further investments. So we saw that 60% of providers said, if universal service support were eliminated, they would cancel 80% of their investments in 2025 to the tune of about $1 billion of investment. That's obviously not what anyone wants to see in terms of broadband advancement and availability, but that's another potential implication. A third, I think, one to pay attention to is the effect on loans. The fact is, again, most of these networks in rural areas to date were not built using grants. They were built using loans or private capital. And 67% of our members reported still having loans outstanding with respect to prior network builds, 70% of those with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which actually, interestingly, has yielded a positive payback to the U.S. Treasury through the repayment of those loans over time with interest. Those kinds of loans would be at risk. We got a response that 61% of members might default within 3 years on their loans if they had no other way of recovering the universal service support they've lost. Again, you can see a mix of ways of trying to manage through this. Those give you some indicators of the importance of universal service funding to rural communities, to rural consumers, to the capital markets as well. In terms of the court decision and the effects of that, or how that's going to play out next, Glenn talked a lot about the sort of judicial process, the 6th and 11th Circuit, the 9-7 vote in the 5th Circuit. I'm not going to repeat that. I guess a couple of things I just want to highlight there. The first is, I'm not perhaps as sanguine, or maybe I'm Pollyannish on the Supreme Court's review of this. I do think that the precedent here tends to be in favor of the program continuing. There are intelligible principles in 254 far beyond what other cases have found before to be fine under the intelligible principle standard that the Supreme Court has articulated. There's been some dissents that previously suggested perhaps going further, but nothing in a majority opinion that really, I think, should put this program at risk. Obviously, the 5th Circuit found differently, and the Supreme Court will take a look at that. The other piece I want to highlight, though, is the double-layered delegation. Glenn mentioned this a bit, but the finding was not that the delegation from Congress to the FCC by itself was a problem, nor was it the FCC's use of USAC that was a problem. It was the combination of those two. The court actually did not find that independently either of those delegations was a problem. They asked some questions about it, but they didn't reach that. The finding was that it was a double-layered delegation, which no one had ever really heard of before. And in fact, the petitioners didn't even ask for or argue specifically as well. So it will be interesting to see how the Supreme Court addresses that rather novel theory here. And I think that also plays into, as I'll talk about in a minute, what the FCC could do in this space. Obviously, Glenn mentioned, and you mentioned as well, John, that there's legislative activity around this, a working group. I think the working group is well aware of the court case, of course, and is thinking about what steps it could take as part of substantive reform of the contribution mechanism and USF otherwise to inoculate or address the court's concerns about the 5th Circuit's concerns about delegation and to try to shore that up, even as the Supreme Court might consider this. We're hopeful. We've seen a lot of good work from that group to date, discussions to date. Hopefully, we'll see some text from them at some point that helps everybody to understand where this might head next. That group's also talking obviously about substantive contribution reform too. And I'll just digress there for a minute to say, Glenn raised some different ways of doing this. we've always operated under the principle that all users and beneficiaries of the networks, of the services that Universal Service supports, should be contributing essentially to their health and well-being. That's kind of what drove Universal Service in the first place as a fee system, is that everybody benefited from access to this network, including those who weren't necessarily getting subsidized or supported, but they benefited from more people being connected to this network effect. So for us, that includes not only broadband users in some way, whether it's connections or revenues, and we've been a part of the USF Forward Coalition, as you noted. It also includes big tech. It includes cloud services. It includes B2B services. All of these, I think, are things that are under discussion now legislatively, potentially. There have been bills out there in the past to look at some of these. Glenn raised the point about the definitional aspects of this. It will take an act of Congress to define, I think, these things and give the FCC the authority it needs to tackle this piece of the puzzle. But we think this is an important piece, and it's one that I think there are analyses underway to help provide that definitional boundary and help to get Congress to a place where they could enact a statute that's specific on this and gives the FCC the additional authority to bring in these other users and beneficiaries as well. And we think that'd be a good idea. You're going to broaden the base so widely at that point that no one group is bearing a disproportionate, or, as the statute refers to it, inequitable burden. We hear some people talk about appropriations as an alternative to this in some of the substantive reform debates. For everybody who's lived through ACP as the canary in the coal mine, that's what happens when you depend upon appropriations. It also doesn't work in rural network economics in particular, because our members are making investments that are going to be recovered in 10 to 20 years' time, and they're putting their own private capital at stake. We're taking out loans to do this. In many cases, even in a grant, you're providing matching capital. So, to say that basically we're going to do this on an annual appropriation cycle is going to really discourage and deter providers from participating in this. It's going to ultimately, I think, defeat or undermine, at least significantly, the promise and what we've seen these programs deliver to date. There's the question of what the FCC can do on remand as well. And I would just say that that's part of the double layered delegation piece. The FCC may have some opportunity and tools in its toolkit to address the remand if it needs to, but it doesn't need to right now because of the stay and the pending Supreme Court review. So, we'll see how that plays out, but it's certainly something for the FCC to look at. At the end of the day, I think, obviously we're all on pins and needles about what the court will do, whether it'll take this case up after presuming the FCC seeks cert. I think others may seek cert as well. But these programs are so important to these rural communities, to these anchor institutions. And I think members of Congress in particular realize that by and large. So I remain hopeful that we will find a way and come up with a plan to see this forward and provide some stability, even with this uncertainty right now. So thanks, John.
Very good, Mike. Thank you so much. Very power-packed presentation. Next, we have an opportunity to hear from Seth Cooper, who is a very thoughtful analyst and author of universal service policies and judicial policies as well. So Seth, thank you so much for joining us. And you've got some slides too to help guide our conversation. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, John. I have a telecom policy background, but when I approach universal service, it's just simply a high level constitutional principle level and just as a taxpayer measure. And in saying that, I think there are problems with the Universal Service Fund as it's constituted today that require reform to make it fiscally sustainable, to ease the burden on consumers, and to put its constitutionality on sound footing and beyond doubt, and ensure that it's sufficiently politically accountable. If you go to the next slide, or if that's possible, I think certainly one of the most immediate problems is, put it together as sort of a bucket, as the system is, it's outdated and physically unsustainable. And that's not an outdated being a criticism as such, but it was established through the 1996 Act. It was focused on voice telephony. That was a long time ago, and things have moved on. The budget was much smaller then. It's much bigger today at around $8+ billion. We've certainly seen in the last decade a lot of growth, for instance, in the Lifeline program, and the E-rates doubled in particular in terms of distributions. And meanwhile, the contribution base, while the budget has grown, the contribution base has contracted. If you look at some of the USF monitoring reports, it puts the contribution base at about $66 billion in 2012, and as of 2022, it was about $35 billion. And so consequently, we've seen this dramatic rise in the surcharge rate, which is effectively the tax that voice consumers pay on the long distance portion of their bill. It was hovering 5 to 6% or so in 2000. It was, in the 10% neighborhood, 2005, about 16, 17%, 2015, and we're now at that record 35.8% surcharge today. And so that's very burdensome. And if you could move to the other slide here, there's also, I believe that there is a constitutional defect in the way it is structured for the contribution mechanism. I think a lot of those concerns were articulated by the 9-member NBank panel majority. I'm not going to go into as much detail from Consumers Research versus FCC, that August decision. I just simply found satisfying that the court called it a USF tax, because I think that's functionally what it is. That's what I pay. I think that the power to tax, to the extent it's even delegable at all, it needs to be very zealously guarded. And really, I think actually Judge Ho made a nice statement in his short concurrence talking about the principle of no taxation without representation. Some people treat that as kind of a slogan. I actually think that is a deep and very important separation of powers principle, that if you are going to be taxed, you need to have the taxing decision made by a body that is elected and answerable to the people. So I thought Glenn did an excellent job in going through a lot of the discussion and the analysis that the court gave. Yes, the court did, I think, go out, although I agree with the result, I acknowledge the court went out on a limb in its analysis. It kind of analogized from removal cases about this double removal for cause issue, and then kind of extrapolated from that the idea of this double delegation, this delegation to the FCC combined with a subdelegation to the USAC as a private corporation. The court found that the terms of the statute of Section 254, the authorizing language for the USF, was vague and more aspirational in its terms and not specific. I actually agree with that. How confident I am the Supreme Court is going to uphold it, I'm not so sure. And even this coming as from someone who has agreed with a lot of the court's decisions, reining in administrative state excess, the court has in this last term twice reversed the Fifth Circuit. I'm talking about the Moody decision and the Murthy decision involving Texas social media law, and the other decision about basically government, coercing or pressuring social media companies to censor private people. And so it remains to be seen. And people will agree, people will disagree where it ends up with the Supreme Court. I do agree with the stay. There are a lot of important reliance interests for the Universal Service Fund, and my hope is this will help prompt Congress to address the issue. And if you go to the next slide, I think none of the problems that I've mentioned are things that are not fixable. They could all be fixed, or at least the concerns I have, if they're not strictly Supreme Court jurisprudence, they are at least constitutional policy, and they're policy concerns that a lot of us have as consumers and taxpayers. And it's just simply being a little more specific in the statute. I think Congress can and should expressly identify, for instance, broadband services for USF support, and just be a little more specific with some principles or criteria for defining contribution amounts and how that's done. My colleague, Free State Foundation President Randolph May, and I, we like the idea of congressional appropriations on a multi-year basis. I recognize annual appropriations would be too probably destabilizing and too much of a roller coaster, but accounting for those uncertainties, I think in the alternative, or at least there could be some combination, Congress could also expand the base, the contribution base to Universal Service Fund. I think that's entirely reasonable. We have, massive social media platforms, online e-commerce, digital advertisers who benefit substantially, benefit the most from universal internet service connectivity. It's become very burdensome on voice providers to shoulder all of the USF fees, which they recoup from consumers. And so I think a broadened base would also be an excellent alternative. It ought to be explored. Congress, I think, could direct the FCC to study that question. The FCC probably has the authority to do it now, but would probably be a lot more confident and really looking at all sides of it if Congress were to direct them to study the matter. There's been a bill out in Congress at different times called, last few Congresses, including this one, called the Fair Contributions Act. In the current Congress, it's S856. That's S856. And that would require the FCC to study the issue of changing, expanding the Universal Service Fund contribution base to different types of providers. Looking at perhaps like the companies that generate the most annual revenue, or companies that generate the most, spur the most data traffic, or something like that, and have different options to consider and weigh the pluses and minuses. I think that would be excellent and get us going. One day I would hope not only this measure would maybe ease the burden on consumers and distribute a little more evenly, but maybe some of these future one-time subsidies that when they're finally spent, like the BEAD program and things like that, perhaps that would actually result in more build out and maybe a reduced operating costs for providers going forward, and maybe there could be some further relief for the Universal Service Fund. But I think in the meantime, my takeaway ultimately is I would like this Fifth Circuit decision just simply to be an impetus for Congress to step up and make the reforms happen, and to make Universal Service Fund physically sustainable for the future and less burdensome for consumers.
That's a great close, Seth. Thank you so much for that description and for your opinions. Now we're headed towards the wild and woolly Q&A period. So I invite all our speakers to come back online. Let me start, Glenn, with you and turn to the first question that was raised in the Q&A box, because the Fifth Circuit ended its opinion by remanding the Fifth Circuit case back to the FCC for further proceedings. I believe that was the exact language, for further proceedings.
Right.
And yet the FCC has not taken any further proceedings. And I guess my personal point of view is that it would make sense for the FCC to at least open up a notice of inquiry or something like that to start taking comments on how to deal with this double delegation problem that Mike Romano identified. It does seem to me that the FCC could improve change its relationship with USAC so that there's no excess delegation to USAC, and that would be one way of trying to address the Fifth Circuit's concerns. But what do you think? What do you think the FCC should do in response to this Fifth Circuit decision?
Intuitively, John, I agree with you. And we were on a webinar together in July, and I think we were both of the mind at that point, right afterwards, no harm, no foul to go out with a public notice and ask the world, how do we fix this, right? Which is what they would normally do, I think, after a remand like that. I'm not in the inner workings of the General Counsel's office. I don't know whether they have some concern that if they had done that, that may have moved the Supreme Court to sort of maybe not take cert. Maybe they're waiting to confirm that the court's going to take cert. Maybe they're just so confident that they're going to win on appeal to the Supreme Court that they haven't done that. But and maybe my other panelists think that there would be a downside to asking, but to me, and I think we agreed in July that, I would have thought that would have been the next step, that, ask the world, listen, we have this one decision that's different than the others. Is there some way to fix this?
All right, so you and I are on the same wavelength here, but I do take, earlier on I'd heard the FCC was not going to open a proceeding because it thought it might jeopardize the chances to get a stay. But now the stay has been granted. So maybe that's right. Maybe they're waiting for the Supreme Court to grant cert, but we'll see. Mike Romano, I'd like to come back to you, both if you have any thoughts to what Glenn just said, but also I was interested to hear Seth's comment about a multi-year appropriation idea. I know you, in your comments, said, well, Congress is not reliable to provide that specific, predictable, and sufficient funding that's called for in Section 254. So an annual appropriations would be too risky and not allow your companies to plan. But is there some value and virtue in a multi-year appropriation, as Seth has suggested? Would that make you feel better?
Well, yeah, many is better than one, but I think the issue we still face there is, and Seth noted the reliance interest. So when any provider makes an investment in a rural market where the ROI is often measured in decade or decades. I mean, there's a reason USDA loans were repayable, and those were the only loans you could really get for deployment in rural areas early on. The reason they were paid over 20 years, because that was the only ROI you could really justify. I mean, there's a reason the market hasn't gone there to serve it to date. So, I don't know what sort of the process would be for getting a multi-year appropriation that is of a length or duration that is equivalent to essentially an RDOF term, for example, right? The RDOF auction said, we're going to guarantee you a support level of a certain amount for 10 years. And in inducement for that, you're going to then go deploy broadband and provide services at a certain rate over that 10-year period. I don't know how one does that if the appropriation process is 1 year or 2 years or 4 years. I mean, how can the government make that promise and induce the provider? What would the provider's resort be should the government then not provide that? What does it do? Can it just raise the rates to the consumers at that point, or abandon the marketplace? I think those are the kinds of questions that arise in the context of an appropriations discussion. And to Seth's point too, I think there are other steps that could be taken first to improve, or he may have said first, but there's other steps that could be taken to improve the system. The one thing, John, I just want to mention, picking up on Glenn's point about what the FCC could do on remand, just a couple things. First, the stay is only good through September 30th right now, right? So, or I guess the stay is good as long as the FCC petitions for cert through September 30th and whatever the Supreme Court does. So there is still concern how long that stay lasts, what's the lasting effect of it. The other thing too, I think that may be influencing the FCC, if I had to guess, and like Glenn, I don't have insight into the OGC's every thought, is I'd rather know what I'm aiming for. Do I want to see what the Supreme Court says so that I'm not doing this twice potentially, because I fix it and then the Supreme Court finds there's a different problem. So it may be they're trying to sequence it in such a way that may, maybe they can still open up a PN or a notice proposed rulemaking to ask questions about it, but that may be informing some of the decision here as well.
All right, that's a fair point. Perhaps that's what the FCC is thinking, but I know they're determined to get this Fifth Circuit decision overturned. Seth, if I could turn back to you on this question about, is this a tax or not? I think that there's an argument that the Universal Service Fund contribution, it does benefit the payors, even though the Fifth Circuit said it did not benefit, and that was one of its reasons for finding it to be a tax. But the money raised specifically goes to improve telecommunications services and broadband services for a select set of different stakeholders, and the payors benefit from having more connections to the network. It benefits them economically. They have more products and services to sell. It benefits the strength of the network effects, but also there's a kind of a social impact too on the country, having more people connected that the broadband payors will benefit from. So doesn't that tend to argue that it should be considered a fee and not a tax?
Most of America are voice consumers. I got it paid. It's listed on my line item, just functionally to me, just the same thing as whatever telecom taxes might be or sales taxes. I understand the network effect. It is to my benefit that other people are reachable through the network. It would be there wouldn't be much of a point if I couldn't. And arguably there's benefits to my paying taxes for roads and water and sewage and garbage too. But at the end of the day, it's just functioning to me like a tax, and that's kind of what I appreciate about the decision. I just wanted there to ultimately be some electable body that you're answerable to, and this is kind of an issue that I even thought about. 20 years ago, I was a law clerk, and we had I was at a state Supreme Court, and we had a decision. There was a case involving a government agency that was imposing a tax on people. It was regional transit or something like that, transportation, and it was by a board. Consisting of some elected officials, hodgepodge of people from random government, thing here or there, but a lot of them were appointed people as well, and they had taxing authority, and there was zero accountability or answerability of those people to anybody whatsoever. And the trial judge said, well, no taxation without representation, that's just a slogan. I just take that very seriously. If something comes that close, I just don't find these fine distinctions with fees and taxes to me very persuasive. Just as a general taxpayer, it's maybe a little different about what the Supreme Court ultimately may say or where its jurisprudence is. They had to go back pretty far. Admittedly, the Fifth Circuit to its decisions a little murky to me. I would just like to see our elected officials weigh in more definitively on these matters for revenue that end user people, voice consumers have to pay.
Gotcha. Okay, well, I want to come back to the political leaders question in a couple of minutes, but before we do that, back to Glenn. I think there's a fair chance that, more than a fair chance, that the Supreme Court takes up this case. Don't you agree? And that they will, because of the split in the circuits?
Yes. Yes. I mean, I'm not sure what else you're looking for, but I mean, I'd be shocked if they didn't. I mean, it needs to be resolved, right? I mean, but again, Mike made the point. I think maybe Mike's generally more optimistic than me, but I don't know what the court's going to do. I mean, they've been all over the place, and we know that at least at some level there is this distrust of the administrative state. So I think reliance here is, if that's the FCC's best path, I don't know what the court's going to do, and frankly how long that decision's going to take. So there'll be a lot of uncertainty, and to Mike's point about folks rely on this for making investment decisions. If I'm a lender and there's ambiguity here, am I going to be cautious about throwing money at projects that I may or may not get reimbursed for a year from now? So the Supreme Court will, even if they take this case up, it'll be in the next term, right? I mean, so it could be a while. So I just think that you need to be a bit more proactive in trying to solve the problem. And then that doesn't resolve the other issue, which is the ballooning contribution factor, right? Maybe we get past the fact that it's constitutional to keep the setting, but you're going to go forward in a system where we're going to be at 40% next year, and all the service providers are going to be doing their best to figure out how to reconfigure their services and their offerings so that they could be information services or non-telecom, because no one's going to want to slap 40% taxes, fees, whatever you want to call them, at the bottom of every bill. So we can get past the constitutional problem. Doesn't get us past the unsustainability of a factor that has just gone up crazy over the last 10 years.
Well, let me pick up on that point and come back to both Mike and Seth, because I can see the argument why platform providers benefit from everybody having broadband. And I can see that there is an argument that they should be required to contribute as well. But as mentioned, that would take an act of Congress to give the FCC that authority to assess the online providers. And to be frank, I don't really see that happening. And so politically, and so I'm picking up on Glenn's point, we can't let the current system, the problem is getting worse and worse and worse. And so that's what leads me to think that assessing broadband services to support and expand the base would be a practical solution that the FCC can do under its current statute. And that would significantly reduce the contribution factor from 35% down to 4%. But maybe I'm wrong. Mike, and then Seth, do you want to make a case for how Congress could actually get to a point where it would assess the online providers as an alternative mechanism?
Oh, yeah, sure. So in this case, I tend to think of, especially in DC, it takes a crisis to fix a problem. And that's a little bit of what we're dealing with here, right? I mean, Glenn makes a good point. Even if we get through the crisis of the sort of existential nature of universal service and the ability to collect contributions, you still got to fix the problem. And I wonder if the two being paired together might not spur legislative activity that otherwise might not have been enacted, right? And so I do think that, that's the working group, when it started, was tackling the substantive question of contribution reform. I think if anything, maybe its work could be accelerated and hopefully will be more focused, precisely because this looming threat of the court case is out there. I know that they've got to work through things. It's an election season. Nothing really is going to happen right now, of course. But, there's people continuing to work and talk about this. So the point of me being Pollyannish about maybe the Supreme Court addressing it, I think, it'd be foolhardy at the same time to put all eggs in one basket. I think Congress ultimately, to Seth's point, would be great if Congress would speak to this with more clarity because it would avoid the issues that Glenn was talking about with people self-classifying what services are in which buckets to avoid contribution, for example. So I do think there's a pathway through Congress. I think that there is potentially a greater impetus over time, especially as the court case unwinds and people see how oral arguments go, how briefing goes, for Congress to step in and to both address the delegation issue and to broaden the base to include all sorts of users and beneficiaries. Yes, there'll be people throwing rocks on all sides about you shouldn't include broadband, you shouldn't include big tech. And those typically are people who represent those interests specifically. But if you broaden the base widely enough, you're right, you get a 4% contribution base, you might get even much lower still and have it be more sustainable because it's on such a broad foundation. So I'm not Pollyannish in the sense that I'm blind to the barriers that are there, but I do think there is some level of momentum, and there's already a group talking about it, which is incredibly helpful.
Gotcha. All right, fair enough. Seth, your view. What do you think the politics are in support of your suggestion?
Oh, probably, Graham. I just endorse everything that Mike just said. That was sort of one of the reasons I thought this decision from the Fifth Circuit could help heighten the sense of urgency needed for the reform that was already present with simply the contribution surcharge issue and the fiscal, dangers that the program, USF program, is already facing. And I do think having a study bill or having some more concrete options floating around could be helpful. Putting it all on broadband internet service providers, the internet access service providers, I think that should be avoided, putting it all on them. We've had a moratorium on internet access taxes, and the idea of ensuring affordability of universal service becomes undermined, the higher the surcharge for the end users of the service that you want to subsidize and get people access to. And that is why I think some of these other beneficiaries from the online edge providers, some contribution from them would be very helpful, not necessarily reflected on a consumer bill, and help promote universal access.
So if I can weigh in on a
Sure.
couple of things, why wouldn't it show up on a consumer bill? Why won't those edge providers, arguably to the extent that you're assessing them as a result of something why isn't that just going to get passed through to consumers? I think that's the first point. But the idea that by assessing broadband at 4%, that adding, if $75 is the, or $80 is the current price of broadband, by adding $3 a month to someone's bill, and it's going to shift because other parts of your bill will go down to the extent you buy wireless or other voice services, that's really going to be a tipping point for anyone who can afford it. I think the other side of it was everybody's worried about affordability. I think everyone recognizes that to the extent we assess broadband, folks that are eligible for Lifeline or other subsidy programs would likely be exempted from that assessment. So I think it's a little bit Pollyannish again to sort of suggest that Congress could figure out who to define that for what is big tech, whether it's digital advertising, whether it's websites. The FCC is having enough problems trying to corral the entities that it knows it does regulate to now open that up to say another 1,000 companies that are going to have to be submitting 499s. It is a nightmare scenario. I think you guys are smoking something to think that there's a way for Congress to come up with definitions to try to expand the base by going beyond what are traditional communications service companies. I think it's just not going to happen. Or if it happens, it's going to be a mess.
So Glenn, John, can I jump back in on that? Just because this
Sure.
definitional piece it is incredibly important. I don't want to short sell how important it is, but there have been pieces of legislation out there that have in other contexts address who falls within the category of an edge provider or tech platform or what have you that could be looked to and could be modeled after. And then you could look at defining the revenue. I mean, there are industry codes out there, classifications, things like that you could pull from to more clearly delineate who's in and out of it. I don't mean to, again, this is not snap of the fingers easy. It's not. But, if Congress were to direct the FCC to say, basically assess these kinds of providers and gave some definitional bounds to that were based upon certain industry classifications and it is, I think, it's something that could be done. I do think, Glenn, to your point, it's going to get passed through no matter who you assess it upon, because they're going to in turn want to look to figure out how they recover that. So I would agree with that fully. I mean, at the end of the day, though, one last point I did want to make on the broadband piece, Glenn, I do agree with your point about sort of the elasticity of demand in the broadband marketplace. We put out 2 studies, one in 2020, one in 2022, that looked at a connections-based assessment on broadband and found that there was going to be an immaterial effect on adoption and retention of broadband associated with a connections-based charge that was probably going to be in the neighborhood of 80 to 90 cents per month at that point in time, based upon the size of the fund, which really hasn't grown. I mean, I also hear a lot of people talk about the growth in the fund. It's not the growth in the fund that's the problem. In the last 10 years, I actually pulled the stats. 2015, the fund was $8.37 billion. In 2021, it was $8.5 billion. And in 2023, it was $7.3 billion. And that might have been a dip due to some change in the program, but it is the supply side that's the issue that we've got to really solve for here. And I don't think assessing broadband should suppress demand for broadband, but it's an important piece, I think, of a bigger puzzle, broadening the base.
Good deal. Seth, did you want to respond to any of that, or should I go on to the next question?
Yeah, move on to the next question. Those are good, thoughtful responses. Give me plenty to think about.
Okay, well, just to answer one other question in the Q&A box, the reason the FCC has not moved forward with a proposal to assess broadband is it was afraid that fee would be imposed on consumers' bills. But in that report to Congress, the FCC chairwoman seemed to endorse the idea of assessing online advertising. And under the theory, I think that could not be passed on to consumers' bills. So is assessing online advertising different from assessing platform providers? Can you provide any clarity? Is that are those 2 different proposals, or is that the same? And can a fee on advertising be passed through to consumers' bills? That's for anybody.
I'm not even sure what online advertising is. So when I open up my browser, if it offers to sell me a new coffee maker, presumably I use, whatever internet service provider that I'm at, whether it's Safari or Verizon or whoever, I don't know what they charge Keurig to advertise for those, that Keurig coffee maker. I guess part of the question is going to be, notifying and making it clear to all these people that now they are subject to these filings. I don't know enough about the online advertising market to know how much that sort of shifts the number to, the contribution base. But again, I think it goes back to how does the FCC, if it does get the authority to do that, make it clear to the world out there that anyone, so to the extent my law firm has an advertisement on its page, is it now going to be subject to that? Or is it only companies that are predominantly in online advertising? If I am on TikTok and I've got, a toothbrush ad that runs underneath my video, is that online advertising? So, if you guys are smart enough to figure all this out, let me know.
Good questions, Glenn. Mike, did you have any further response to
that? The definitional questions are going to be critical. I just don't think that, I think there is a way, if you look at some of the industry classifications, NAICS codes, for example, it's how the FCC for years has classified telecommunications resellers, wired telecommunications providers, right? I mean, or not the FCC, but like Small Business Administration, for example. There are ways to figure out who you're capturing and then to figure out what the widget, the unit is, right? I mean, that's part of the problem we've dealt with in the telecommunications space for this period of time. What's the widget? Is it revenues? Is it connections? Is it numbers? It's taken us, almost 20 years to have a debate just over those. So it's not to say that this isn't complicated stuff, but I also don't think it's impossible or an intractable problem. I think it's just one that requires careful thought. And again, I think Congress could give the FCC some capability to, within bounds, address this and address some of the threshold definitional questions, and then have the FCC run with it. Again, though, the Supreme Court case, unfortunately, I think presents an overhang. It might present an impetus, but it also presents an overhang because everybody's wondering, what can the FCC do, right, in light of a case like this?
Yeah, I'm very afraid that Congress is going to hold up, waiting for the Supreme Court decision before it can take the next step. Last question here in the last minute as we wrap up. Mike, staying with you, Seth mentioned the Fair Contributions Act as a vehicle for reforming this system. Does NTCA support that Fair Contributions Act?
We have, yes, we've supported that and several other measures that would take a look at other ways to broaden the base. Yes, it's consistent with sort of our all users and beneficiaries should be part of the discussion, part of the equation. Yes.
Okay, well, that may be something we take another look at. Glenn, I don't know if you have an opinion about that act.
No, I don't, but I will say that to folks that don't know this, a number of states have actually introduced access lines as opposed to revenue as a contribution mechanism. Now that we've got some years, California a year ago, other states have had it longer, may be worth for the feds to take a look at that to see whether that may be actually another option or numbers. I mean, I don't want to sort of lose sight of the fact there may be better ways to do this.
All right, well, lots of potential solutions, no consensus yet, but I think this webinar has helped clarify the different ideas out there. So hopefully this has been useful. And just as we transition toward the end of this, let me mention, if you found this useful, but you'd like even more in-depth information, we're pleased to invite you to attend our SHLB AnchorNets conference, which is taking place next week from October 2nd through the 4th. We will have panels on E-rate, rural healthcare, USF reform, wireless, the BEAD program, the capital projects fund, cybersecurity, and many, many more topics. You can register at shlb.org/anchornets. And thank you again to our sponsors, Ready, Zayo, T-Mobile, and Cisco. We do not yet have a series of new webinars scheduled. We've had a mad rush of about 6 webinars over the last 3 months, which we've really enjoyed. But we don't have a plan yet. So we'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy these webinars and you'd like us to take up some more topics, please let us know, because we're interested in keeping these conversations going and ultimately to find resources and solutions. So thank you for attending this conference, this webinar. We look forward to seeing you next week at our conference and to hearing from you going forward. So this concludes our webinar. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.